So let me just get my notes. Like I won't share my screen because there isn't really anything to show in terms of like images. But I wanted to say something before. Like, well, one thing is that like this was supposed to be like this sort of like informal thing, really quick, and like slowly I realized that there's like tons of like really interesting things to talk about this, both in regards to a lot of the work that we already talked about, but also to stuff that we haven't really discussed yet, like, you know, like technology and in economics and things that we could definitely kind of move further along if we felt like it. Like there's like some really interesting sort of like proposals for algorithmic socialism or different forms of like algorithmic governance that could have that we could discuss like maybe at some point in the future, and then to sort of like really sort of make the case, I think, against Benanav's argument like about algorithms. Like we would have to do like a kind of session about like modern algorithm architectures, right? Like there's like tons of like insane developments that have been happening over the last like 10 years. And I think that sort of like this is something very crucial that the text misses, I think. Like way back when Gabriel sent the text, I was like, oh yeah, his conception of algorithms isn't like good enough. And then there was this sort of thing, oh, but isn't he a computer scientist? He isn't. He's actually like a historian. And I think that sort of like really helped me make sense of his argument, because I think that he does like three things that I think are very problematic. Like I don't necessarily think that that like algorithmic socialism is the sort of solution for whatever problem, but I just don't think that like the good arguments against it aren't these. And I think that like by sort of looking into these like methodological mistakes that he makes, and in my opinion at least, like it will help us to sort of get a sense of like, okay, like what is this thing that we're talking about? So like I think that there's like mainly three issues with the argument that he presents, which is sort of like, one is just like his understanding of algorithms, like this sort of like very naive enforcement of the qualitative quantitative distinction, and like a unconditional acceptance of the problem of calculation. Like I think that these are like sort of three issues that I think they're like interesting to think about in relation to this. So and as I was saying before, I thought that it would be cool.
What was the third? You said understanding of algorithms, the quantity-quality thing, and then?
And the unconditional acceptance of the problem of calculation.
I see.
And I think that these are sort of like the three main topics that sort of would sort of like lead us to like very different like involvements with stuff that we already talked about. And as I was saying earlier, I thought that like Stefan's Heidenreich book, or some of the excerpts, would be like kind of interesting to sort of give us a sense of like, what is this thing then? Because he doesn't really defines what it is beyond the sort of like straw man. And I thought that like Heidenreich's thing, it's pretty interesting. He did a course at the New Center. Maybe JP can smuggle us some of that like archive stuff later on, because I think it would be interesting to sort of follow his whole argument, like just for the sake of really understanding what he's getting at. So I'll just start with this. So one purpose of money is to distribute goods and labors. In the future, we will be able to solve these tasks differently without money, instead relying on the help of networks, algorithms, and artificial intelligence. Why do it without money? The medium of money combines three functions: payment, value, and storage. In every money economy, the function of storage tends to overshadow the other functions. This tendency is unavoidable because it's inherent to money. The command more is inscribed in it from the very start. The command drives towards a state in which all economic activity is forced to pay tribute. Each valuation of goods and professions shifts in favor of assets and their accumulation. Increasingly, income and property are distributed unequally. This should come as no surprise, since the measures taken by central banks after the crisis in 2008 were limited to the continuous salvaging of assets. Designing a non-money economy would pose a fundamental utopia in opposition to the money economy. This economy would do without money, abolish the storage of value and assets, and replace the functions of value and payment with the algorithmically supported distribution of things and activities. Technically speaking, this is possible because all transactions are already digitally recorded and enough data can be calculated to enhance and replace the market's information function. In this sense, the concept of the non-money economy represents a radical leftist utopia, an economy that strives toward equal economic distribution by changing the current system in a fundamental way, because it pertains to money's nature as a medium. With the increasing amount and density of information, the relationship between prices changes radically. Prices only retroactively express what we already know about the behavior of consumers in the market. Whenever we book a flight, we can see how prices are set up using algorithms. This data head start applies not just to final consumers, but also to large sites of trading. Sporadic flash crashes show what happens when algorithms speculate on stock and other securities. When our profiles, our likes, and our consumer histories are used to calculate who will buy what and where, the entire market becomes condensed to a singular moment for each transaction. That is, if a profiling algorithm can determine the price one is willing to pay for a specific product at a given time and place, there exists one marketplace for the sale. In that case, the price of the item conveys no additional information outside of the single market. Formally speaking, distribution is still depicted in prices and calculated in terms of money, but data currents today already represent the technological foundation of a non-money economy. So he basically thinks that we can extrapolate matchmaking from current prices, and I think it's not so clear how one would do it technically, but I also think that it sort of understands a little bit like all the sort of nuance that is embedded in each transaction and how this sort of gives a sense of structure for economy. I think that for Benanav, I think that he already conflates this with optimization, and I think he doesn't really makes it clear why he conflates with optimization, down to just maybe thinking that we would apply, I don't know, gradient descent to this to determine prices. It's not really elaborated in any sense, but at the same time he makes this sort of he makes the case for having other parameters which are not to optimize goods or to optimize for prices or for better spent resources or things like that, which I think it's a fair, it's a fair point, but I'm also it's not very clear why would the system be set up this way. He doesn't give us anything of oh, this is sort of the logic that it's already embedded in technical systems. He doesn't really articulates in any sense why he thinks that these other parameters cannot be encoded in an algorithm. There's no real sense of why this is the case. And I think that of course, I mean this sort of echoes this sort of, for me at least, this brings another question, which is sort of the questions of data sets and statistical depiction of reality, right? There's this sort of like there's this sort of battle between like what is the world that we get to depict or how accurate it is, but also how to sort of account for the structural inequalities that these data sets would already. Which one? Sorry, I'm just.
The text you quoted from the non-money
Oh, yeah,
moneyless economy was a different one, right?
Oh,
yeah,
my bad.
Yeah. No, I'll just send it to you guys in a bit. But like there's this. Sorry, I lost a little bit track of what I was saying, but like there's no real sense with why like we could not think about algorithms in this other, like to have these sort of different goals. And I think that this also like sort of misses the point that we already encode. Oh, okay, like now I remember the question of like what data sets would we use to sort of train this algorithm, right? Like there's this sort of thing of like to which extent can we depict clearly the world through statistical models? Like there's this sort of inherent question of modeling here, and I sort of get to this a little bit later, but I think that this is like a sort of really broad issue of any sort of like automatizing of decision making. Like there's this question of like how to train this algorithm and what is the sort of data that we use, and by using data from the world we already encode like all the structural inequalities that are already present in the world. So there's this sort of like very complex question of like how do we make use of these systems, right? Like, but also how do we account for the fact that they already are distorted by how the world is, right? Like there isn't really any sense of like what is the sort of like optimal model of the world that then would be encoded in a data set to train like an algorithm. Like this is like a kind of big, I think a big like obstacle for whatever like for whatever central planning we would use. Like we would have to like really consider the way in which this model is designed and what are its sort of parameters. But at the same time, like, you know, there are like many different ways of going about thinking about how to structure data in this sense, right? Like what is like, and I think that there's something that I kind of wanted to get at is that like he makes this sort of feel like he has this sort of like almost like mystical argument, right? Like that human decision makers would somehow give this, like, which is the auto-neura thing and the thing about protocols. Like I understand that this is not really the case, but he has this sort of like almost mystical belief that like human decision makers would like somehow correct these flattening impulses of the algorithm. And I think that this is like a really misguided assumption also. Like there's this very extensive like really extensive research that sort of has as its starting point Daniel Kahneman's book Thinking Fast and Slow, that sort of takes this assumption that we are actually quite bad at predicting things, even based on our expert opinions. So there's like really extensive, there's this really interesting book that I've been sort of reading on and off for a little bit, which is, it's called Platform Machine Capitalism, Platform Machine Crowds, something like this. Let me just get, well, whatever, I'll send it later. But that sort of makes this like really interesting argument how like machine-aided decision-making platform like architectures and crowdsourcing and crowd involvement are really sort of the driving forces of like of this new economy that will come about in some time in the future. But what I found really interesting about all of these things that they cite is that like training like really low dimensional algorithms, like with few parameters, they're able to like completely outclass even the best experts in really specific in really specific tasks, right? Like there's like really like it from a wide range of applications. So there's this one about like electronic equipment performance, which is like a model that has like 3 parameters that the model outperforms experts by something like 26 percentage points. Like it's almost like triple what humans decide. So like focusing the argument on how humans would decide things, right? Like that we would need in this sort of like scenario, humans to like educate the decisions of machines, like doesn't really hold any water, in the sense that like depending on how the algorithms are structured, or the data points are structured, or what parameters we use, we can, and that's also the thing, right? Like all the time he makes this sort of like weird case of like this one master algorithm like to rule them all, and I think that like any sort of like realistic system for planning would have to have like a massive array of different tools to be used and integrated and put against each other, and sort of literally find ways of integrating all this information that these different models produce, rather than just thinking, oh yeah, like we'll just have like this one thing and it will fix everything for us. Like I think that this is like, yeah, like really like a really dumb idea, for lack of a better word. So there's like a bunch of different examples in which, yeah, like really simple algorithms outperform humans, and it's not really like, it's not even close. So I really question this perspective of like having like humans in the loop. I think it's sort of the general term that it's used to describe such systems would produce any benefit, right? Like, I mean, like appealing to human intuition as a sort of means of educating computer-based decisions, like I don't really necessarily think that that holds any ground as an argument. However, there's also something quite interesting in regards to like very restricted problem spaces, let's say, right? Like there's somewhere further in the book, they sort of talk about how like computer aided like chess playing algorithms like not only revolutionized, but like also invented a new format of chess competition, which I thought was quite interesting. Like there's the like machine competition, there's the human competition, and there's what they call the centaurs, which is like groups of humans and algorithms in tune to sort of play chess. And it's also not very surprising that like having like the combination of experts and algorithms somehow produces like better results than just algorithms and just humans, right? Like there isn't really any sort of like novelty to this in a weird way. But I don't think that this is sort of like, I don't necessarily think that this regimen of like constant evaluation of models by human agents or experts or whatever, or groups of humans rather, would somehow like is exactly what he's talking about. Like I tend to see it in a very naive way, that we would provide something that the algorithm lacks in terms of decision making, right? Like I don't think it's necessarily the decision making, but it's much more about like like actually we have to go back and look at it. Like, what is the thing that makes centaurs better than just straight algorithm players in chess? Like, I think that this is a really interesting thing to think about, just in terms of like, what would a human produce, right? Like in terms of insight to these algorithms, or not necessarily insight, but like strategy selection rather, that the algorithm can come up on its own, right? Like there's this sort of like, what is it that is useful about these humans in the loop in this case, right? Like, but I think that this whole thing is like, what are like that the having algorithms would constrain what is necessarily producible in ways that like are against the better judgment of humans. And I think that this is also like, this also takes it into a kind of really bizarre, like automatized society in which there's never any sense of like what is going on at any time, rather than just like decisions are being like pumped out by the millisecond. Like it's sort of like, I think it's sort of like this nightmare scenario where like high frequency trading robots would decide everything for us. Like this is like, of course, like a really interesting science fiction book, but like super far-fetched, right? Like in terms of like actuality.
Pedro,
yeah,
just a question. He's not talking about supervised learning, is he?
I mean, he's not talking about any sort of like, he doesn't really give like a clear sense of
the text, so I don't know. So
no,
sorry for my question.
yeah, no. I think it's a really good question, right? Like the sense in which, like having any sort of sense of like how like modern machine learning algorithms are trained and deployed would give us like a really like a much richer argument, right? Like even the question of like, oh, do we like, can we identify the rules of the market so as to let like an unsupervised learning algorithm train itself in this sort of like AlphaGo style, right? Like what would be like could we formalize the like any sort of like societal mechanics to be extracted or to be encoded to be taught to an autoencoder through like all these iterations? Like, I mean, like I think that this is like a really like maybe a little bit besides the point, but just like a really super interesting question, right? Like, are transformers useful for this? Like, what is the sort of like, what is the sort of like general architecture that could yield good results for this? Like, right, I've been sort of like interested in there's this researcher here in Brazil called Bernardo Furtado. He's a researcher at IPEA, and he's like a big agent-based modeling guy. He wrote a really interesting book about using agent-based modeling for policy decisions. He comes from geography, so he has this sort of like very like already a kind of familiarity with technical tools that comes from working with geography. But I think that the sort of introduction of agent-based modeling as means of testing out how certain policies would perform in the real world is like super interesting. And to think that this is being done in Brazil, it's also like crazy, right? Like the sense in which like, okay, like Brazil's minister of economics is like the sort of like day trader guy, but that we have also this sort of like interesting research being carried out sort of like in sort of the same city. Sort of it's really it's really like dumbfounding to think about these things, but rather like there's also like really some research done by Rand Corporation on how to use agent-based simulations to sort of train machine learning algorithms. So there's like this whole stack, I would say, of different ways of conceiving what like algorithmic socialism or any kind of algorithmic governance could be, thinking about the sort of richness of all of these different tools, right? Like of the kinds of insights that all of these different tools provide, that is just like really out the window, I think, in very simple terms. I think that the question of like how to, let me just go through real quickly my stuff here, is that I think that there's a sort of like weird, like there's this I think that his argument of quality versus quantity is really based on the assumption that something is fundamentally lost when you mathematize it, right? Like there's this like phenomenal quality of the world that it's not captured by numbers, right? Like I think that this is sort of like how I understand it, at least. I don't know if any of you would like to comment on this, but I think that this is like very like a really interesting introduction of like what it means to model in a weird way. Like I think that he quickly chooses to express the belief that there cannot be ways of reconcile. There cannot be ways of encoding qualitative distinctions in societal terms, right? But like maybe it's already this assumption of the preclusion of money, but like we understand the sort of the fundamental markers of wealth, of success in societal terms, right? Like and to think that this could not be encoded is just like really, I don't know, like it sort of reminds me of this like very weird, I don't know how I arrived at this. It's been a while as well, but it's like that like the 10 like of the 10 happiest cities in the world, whatever, like in whatever each way this is measured, because I also think that this is like a really like broad, let's say, measurement parameter, but like a lot of the cities were in Switzerland, which has this sort of like a massive minimum wage. So like it sort of, we would be very hard pressed to not think that there are ways of quantifying all of the things that he puts as unquantifiable, right? Like justice, like how could we quantify justice? Well, I mean, we could. I mean, like I think that only the real like difficulty in quantifying the sort of things that he poses, right? Like between dignity, justice, community, and sustainability, like really just community would be like very hard to quantify, like how to use this as a parameter, like what is community as a parameter, like how to parameterize it. Like I don't really, like I have like really no idea. I think that there's like really, like, let's not say like interesting work, but there has been some work of finding ways of integrating like community or community as a parameter in technological projects. Like I think that this is also something that pertains like a little bit to the discussions that we've been having in relation to the platform. And I think that like this is something that that could be really interesting to think about in terms of like the platform work, of just like how can we measure what are the sort of like assets that we are for one another in that sense, right? Like maybe assets is not a very good term in this perspective, but like just in a sense of like how this could be parameterized, because the assumption of the platform is that it, in a way, it already is, right? Like that there is some sort of way in which a system could be designed to foster a community rather than subsume it into its own rules. And I think that this sort of goes a little bit back to the conversation that we're having about Orbit, like last week or like a couple of weeks ago, about like Modebug's plans for the internet. But anyway,
I wanted to ask you, what do you mean by quantify community exactly? Because it seems you can either build a system that the fact that you have several hubs of information connected one to another that in themselves form a community, but you don't really need to symbolize it I don't know, symbolize it in a logical sense for this to work. Like you just need to embed a certain logic that is responsive to the interrelationship between several hubs, it seems. I'm not sure if you need to quantify community. I just wanted you to clarify this a little bit, perhaps.
Well, like I think that these are sort of like two different things, right? Like I think that at first, like maybe the question that I'm asking in regards to his posing of community as the sort of like fundamental, unquantifiable parameter, together with dignity and justice and sustainability, which, you know, like these are all like very measurable things, right? Like community, I think, would be the sole one that is really hard to quantify, or to think about a system that would foster communities. But at the same time, right, like there are so many examples out in the wild, right? Like there's like the Reddit model, for instance, right? Like where everyone contributes to a certain topic, and there's a vote of like whatever it is, the like what is upvoted and downvoted, what is like relevant or irrelevant. Like there's a sort of sense in which,
okay, I see
like
I was interpreting it in the sense of having like a system that means that is in place of community. You see, like you have a logical system wherein you have some operator that is in place of community, or in place of these other things you were mentioning. Whereas what I think you mean, I understand now, is that how do you quantify community in the sense that what is the measure one hub I'm calling these hubs, okay, just to keep
sure,
network image going on. I mean, how much value does one hub has for another, so to speak, like, or the action performed by a hub has for another one. Like it's a way of quantizing value, actually, in a sense, right? One for the other. So in Reddit, like the most voted content, like not necessarily the hub, because you can have like an anonymous platform that functions through voting, and you know this assigns value to some action within the network. But nevertheless, you have to adapt a little bit what I'm talking about, because there's of course several different models. But you know what I mean? Like I think if I understood correctly, you want something, you're gesturing towards something that will assign a value to one action performed within the context of a community of hubs or something like that, right?
Well, for instance, right, like this, like I think that, like, far from being perfect, the Reddit model, or just like the way that we, like, you know, like the way that like Twitter has this sort of like very specific economy of like influence, right? Like there's like, by putting out content that is interesting for you, you sort of already like enters a community, right? Like maybe this is, you know, like thinking too pragmatically in terms of like the space of reasons or whatever, but like there's this like real sense in which to participate in a community, it's simply to participate in a community, right? Like, and this, like there's several models of participating in a community that can be quantifiable, or rather like Instagram would not like completely replace like every other marketing strategy in how things are commercialized today, right? Like if there's no way in which to quantify and measure the way the community influences the distribution of goods, like Instagram would not work in that sense, and it does, right? Like, I mean, like we're not sure that it does, right? Like there's no like transparency, like internal transparency of saying like, oh, like we did like how many ever sponsored posts and we got back this engagement for that is translatable in this much revenue, right? Like I'm not sure that it exists and that it's like constantly being put to proof, right? Like that it's constantly being evaluated for the way in which it produces like the goal that it has, whatever that may be. But I think that like in thinking about especially how like image, like how Instagram has completely changed the image-based work network and economy, it's so telling that it does in fact can be measured, right? Like I think that like for me to really like buy into this argument, I would have to be like convinced that you cannot, that you fundamentally lose something about community. And of course, like we're talking about like very specific considerations, right? Like we're not saying that like it's a healthy community. We're not saying that it's like a productive community. We're not saying that it's like this sort of like utopian community of equal minds. But I'm saying that like structurally, there's nothing that would preclude it for being so, right? Like there's like infinite proposals of like how to tweak these systems into ways of building actual communities. And I think that like there's also this sort of like weird assumption of like, oh, like, you know, like the engine of, like the internet is an engine of disinformation, and like Facebook's role in the last Trump campaign, it's like some sort of like proof of that. But like the reality is that like the business model dictates it, right? Like it's not some sort of like weird like Nick Land style outside in Xeno agent. It's just like, well, like for them, it's like a very clear decision by human agents. They're like, we lose money if we don't do it. And there's nothing to say in our like in our own like sort of like governance charter that prohibits us from doing it. So like, why don't we just do it, right? Like there isn't really a sense. And I think that there's a kind of like something that permeates all of this is like, what is the kind of infrastructure that it's required for these systems to be a reality, right? Like of sort of like the let's say the socialist, what is the socialist stack in some sense of like of tools and platforms that would allow these parameters to be articulated in the ways that we feel are representative of the world that we want. And I think that something that the text sort of like alludes to, and I think that it's like very like, yeah, I think it's good at doing that, is the sense in which sometimes by making these arguments for the technologization, like a very specific, right, like technologization of governance, we would somehow like magically rid society of its problems. If like we only could be fairer or more precise, like things would be better. And I think that this is like, but in this, like, this is an argument to sort of go against, right? Like that there's something like inherently more just about the way in which technology would operationalize these parameters. But I also think that like this is precisely the way in which I think that the qualitative versus quantitative distinction is bad, because it's sort of like completely fetishizes mathematization, right? Like that there's this sort of way of doing things that it's fairer because it's rational, right? Like that's the sort of like very bad like two-line explanation of like Yudkowsky style rationalism, like internet rationalism. Like if we all were versed in math and engineering, like the world would be better for it. Like, and yeah, sure, it might be, but like it also might not, because there's a sort of like just like massive hole in the ways in which the application of these systems is constantly used to oppress several members, like several groups in society and everywhere, right? Like there's sort of like very like dumb, like maybe dumb's not a good word, but like there's this sort of very naive perspective that you know, like very like traditional sciencey figures like Dawkins, Richard Dawkins, and people like him sort of put forward, like, oh, like you're all like monkeys that like religion or whatever. Like if we're all like more math inclined, things would be better. But I also think that going so far to the other side that you'd completely abandon these tools is also like throwing the baby together with the bathwater. Like there isn't really a sense of like measuring these two approaches, and I think that like that's very much the sort of like the, let's say, like correct solution for this kind of thinking. Like of course we should like welcome like a diverse array of tools in decision making, but that doesn't really, but unless we already start with like perfect conditions, like we would still need to change how things are, because like there's no sense in which these automatically would lead to these solutions, right?
Pedro, can I just, I mean, I know that some people also didn't read Ben Anab's text, like Reza was mentioning. I think that I had a bit of an, I don't know, I just wanted to comment and see what you think on some things. Because I have the impression that, like, I'm happy that Ben Anab's text served kind of two purposes at once, because I think it's similar enough to a line of thought that I think you are already kind of debating with, to kind of help introduce kind of, in my opinion, a debate that is not the debate of the text, which I think goes through lines that you are arguing that I think are totally reasonable for me, make total sense. For example, the fear of technical tools in politics, the sort of naive position that there is some sort of special quality about direct human decision-making that is easily criticizable, and I think you made really good points against it. The sort of scarecrow constructions concerning what, you know, automation, computation, and so on mean, which I think, again, you're kind of giving us an alternative, a much richer picture. So I think that the points that you raised, right, the understanding of algorithms, the quantity quality thing, and the third point, which I had a bit of a harder time understanding exactly what you meant by the unconditional acceptance of calculation, because I didn't see him either arguing in favor nor against exactly. Like, I didn't know how to fit it into the argument of the text, but But in any case, like just to give a bit of context to Benanav's text, right? And which I think also brings a second line of debate, which I really wanted to hear you on it. And I don't think ultimately, I don't think you really commented on it, because I think that all the similarities between his text and this larger debate that you kind of went to kind of mobilize most of your argument. And the second part, which I think is the singular aspect of his research, I think ended up not being so clear how it fits into this, because the way that I understand it, especially considering this text in the context of his recent book, for example, he wrote a recent book called Automation and the Future of Work. And in that book, he kind of names his interlocutors very clearly, right? The left and right wing accelerationists, and a certain relation they established between politics and technology. And more than that, more specifically than that, his critique is a critique of the diagnosis that is made of the relation between technology and labor, right? He is a quantitative sociologist. When I said he was a computer engineer, it's just because in the book, he says that his dad was a researcher in automation, and that he worked with his father on a kind of software company before he started his academic training in economics. So it wasn't like he's a trained graduate computer engineer, as I thought. It's just like
not that makes like tons of difference, right? Like, because I'm like also not like, I don't have a computer science
but definitely
degree, right?
it's not something like he spent 5 years studying computer engineering and that stuff. So anyway, but my point is that he's a quantitative sociologist and historian who looks at the relation between automation and labor and says, guys, the diagnosis that you're building your whole perspective on automation, unemployment, and freeing of labor, and therefore there is a certain connection between the benefits of automation, the increase in chronic unemployment, and these two things can kind of explode together in a positive sense in a couple of interesting public policies, strategies for the left, and things like this. But he says that early diagnosis is his first point of where he sees a problem, right? And his position in the book is that rather than the theory that the increase in automation has led to an increase in productivity, less need of labor, therefore a freeing of the masses of labor power, which are therefore unemployed, and kind of creating a sort of overbearing of welfare state having to deal with these people and all sorts of migration problems and so on. He says, well, we actually have a crisis of stagnation in the productive sector. We don't have a situation of increased productivity because productivity rose, but outputs went down. So you're capable of producing more, but there is no reason to produce more because there's no one to buy it. And the consequence of this for the labor market is that people are employed, but in increasingly shittier jobs, informally employed, and there's a sort of sub-employment crisis, which is different. People are not freed from it in any way. So it starts with this kind of diagnosis debate with his comrades. He's from the EndNodes group. He has good relations with Nick Schneercheck or whatever his name is, and those guys. Like, it's not like it's a bellicose debate. And obviously, being friends with those guys, he's not the guy who's saying technology bad. Let's have utopian 19th century socialism back, where we just talk things through and it's all for the best. Like, in the first part of his text, he says, like, digital socialism is focusing on technological tools, and they, of course, have emancipatory potential, but they really don't do the trick. And my understanding is that there's all sorts, I totally agree with you, there's all sorts of simplifications. They might be rhetorical or to lack of knowledge about the areas, which I totally feel like they're really good kind of jumping boards to discuss this sort of technophobia, naive understandings of what quantification is and things like this. So I understand exactly why that warrants a debate with, let's say, the worst version of this text, where it is, let's say, from what you said, it looks like you were debating, in my opinion, with a sort of guy arguing for direct, folk, immediate, collective decision-making against technology. Let's not even dwell with that and mess with that in a way that's totally capitalistically absorbed or whatever. But I had the impression that the best version of his text is the one where, because he's a labor historian, right? People who study unemployment study labor. His focus is on the relation between resource allocation and production, right? I think Pedro dropped. And this concludes, I'm sorry, you were here, right? You there, Pedro? Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Sorry, I thought you dropped.
I dropped, but like now I'm two people. I'm co-host and me.
Yes, you're. Yeah, I don't know how to change that. So.
No, it's fine.
Okay. But my point is that I feel like there is the good core of the text. The point that I feel like he wants to make as a positive point, like to debate, is that the logic of production is not simply reducible to the logic of how much you need of what, right? And how much you output of what. In fact, if you stop to think about it, 99% of the time, commodities are being consumed either by individuals or productively. And very small amount of time, commodities are in circulation, right? Money is always in circulation. But commodity, and that can give us the impression that to talk about commodities is to talk about exchange and money and other types of exchange. But the true life of capitalism happens either with productive consumption or simple reproductive individual consumption. That's where commodities are all the time, right? There are more commodities, let's put it, there are more commodities in the world than in the shops, right? And at that moment, price tags don't matter. And weirdly enough, I mean, it's not that they don't matter, but they're not there. And the weird thing about price systems is that they govern, even though they're, let's say, conditioned by production in some sense, they govern how you look at things inside a production sphere, right? I'm not seeing the price of anything that is around me right now, but I know how to look at things as price, even though I'm outside of the circulation sphere. So the core function of prices, the core function of assessing value, and it's not really resource allocation. That's a crucial problem, but the logic of production, how people work, in which way, with whom, for what ends, that is constrained by value and money, but that's not really, let's say, the language of that part of the commodity world, so to speak, right? And I have the impression that that's the main issue. That's why I think he constantly has I would argue that, or I would reconstruct his argument more as a matter of shift of focus, saying these things are crucial, but they don't really do the whole trick. You should think of them as tools to something else. Not because he is constraining prices to have a smaller role in life, but because in reality, prices already have that role, right? They don't remove the decision-making part simply because not even in capitalism it is interesting to do that. Like even Hayek's argument was precisely that prices are, let's say, they respect the man on the go. People who have a business, prices don't get to decide for them. They just set up the scene of decision, right? Okay, now I need to decide this is the information that I have. So when he talks about protocols, I don't think he's kind of pushing the information system of resource allocation aside to open more space for the human. He's just pointing out a reversal of importance between two things that already exist, right? When you're trying to take your business off the ground, the harder the situation, the more you're obliged to look at the world as made of priceable parts. The more things are hard in your life when you're poor, the more you're obliged to look at things as, okay, I cannot spend the whole shampoo bottle. I can only use a bit of this. It costs 20 reais, so I need to use just a bit because it needs to last the whole month. So the more you're, let's say, against the wall, the more the world looks like it's made of prices, even where prices are not there. But it's still not the logic of allocation that's happening in those moments when you're consuming our shampoo or deciding to hire another person, right? So it's not really a matter of increasing the size of the human element so much as shifting the focus between allocation tools as tools and the productive logic, which is a logic of where you spend 10 hours of your day, which today is spent doing something we call laboring, but it could be thought of in a different way. That logic is already not the logic of resource allocation. And it's not even the same problem. So there is no solution to that problem which deals with this, right? It's slightly different. And I have the impression that he's more about shifting the focus of these two things than, let's say, pushing back technology or kind of for all the ignorance or naivety in the way that he construed the algorithmic socialism, kind of making them less of important allies in the construction of something like this. So I feel like protocols, that's why when he talks about these protocols, he's talking about productive entities, right? I don't know what's the example that he gives, like pencil producers or graphite producers, right? The whole point is that you have, let's say, forms of allocation outside of the production sphere, but you need, the more complex these forms of allocation are, the more information the more multidimensional they are, the more complex it becomes for you to see those things inside of production. What does it mean to look at the making of a pencil and be able to see as it makes a difference which tree it came from, if it's depleting the environment or not, right? In such a way that if you're half strained and put against the wall, you won't reduce everything back to price. That issue is connected to the issue of how many different signals you have about social coordination, but it's not really the same. Like, it needs to be in dialogue with that. But I feel like the term protocol is pretty good to talk about, okay, what is the most kind of routine or habitus-like way of creating a commensurable form of discussion of production and forms of organization that go along with this richer tools, you know? But I'm not sure if I'm making myself clear, but you see, like, I feel like that part regarding production and labor, I don't think it's necessarily automatically covered by the discussion of the fact that he makes a very poor depiction of what algorithms can be and what, you know, multiple forms of technology are available today. So I don't know, I just wanted to hear you about a bit about this as well, because I feel like that's something we didn't really get to touch on.
Yeah, no, for sure. Like, I think that this is like a really interesting perspective. Like, I think that you did like a really generous reading of the text, because also you're like aware of his other work, which I'm
this
not.
is like, this is a cheap text. Like, he wrote it for like.
Yeah, exactly. Like, it can't really be like the end all be all on the subject, but I think that there's something like which I think is really interesting. Like, right, if you think about the problem with like left and right accelerationism, in the sense of like the diagnosis, right, like that there is this sort of way in which we're seeing like humans being replaced by robots, but not in the way that we want to. Like, I think that this is just like a complete fallacy, right? Like, we are not seeing. Yeah. Like, we're just seeing like more and more like horrible jobs coming, like becoming the norm. simply because like, and it's not even that like, because I like to think about this in relation to like Bernardo Furtado and Paulo Guedes, right? Like IPEA is like a public servant institution, and like they produce like really amazing research about economics, and like none of it it's used by the government to produce policies, right? Like there's this sort of like really weird sense of like having like, yeah, we have like all of this like intellectual stuff to draw upon, but we don't use it here. And this is sort of like a very similar, like it has this sort of like similar resonance for me. It's like, yeah, like nothing is being really automated because like automating is still like more expensive than just paying people shit, right? Like there's no real reason to automate yet, right? Like there has to be like a kind of political reason for it rather than like a simply economical reason. And I think this sort of like I kind of really think that like his argument is just like a really like nice argument for democracy, right? Like in a weird way, like a very like optimal utopian democracy. And but I think that the second point is that like I think there's something like really interesting about this of like making this sort of like moving from a logic to another one, right? Like a logic in like a very broad sense, like, right? Like how do you move from this sort of like very like scarcity driven logic, right? To this sort of more, like, I don't know if abundance, it would be the right term. Like then there's this sort of like very different connotations, but whatever, but this sort of like different way of allocating and thinking about how resources are used and deployed to do like stuff with it. But I think that like he makes this argument about that you also repeated, like, right, the like what tree doesn't deplete the environment or whatever. And I think that this is like also like, I mean, like, of course, that makes total sense, right? Like we shift production to minimize the externalities, right? Like that is like, of course, a desirable outcome, right? But I think that it just like there's two ways of thinking about this. One is that it's like, I think my argument is thinking about this in the strategic level of like how to like talk to people in a way that they will get what you're talking about, right? And I think that by making this sort of like very like overt simplification of algorithms, you sort of lose out in convincing people that understand that some of the aspects of things that he talks about are not really are not really a problem in algorithmic terms, right? Like that by sort of like articulating certain issues or focusing on certain issues, you sort of lose your allies or people that might be your allies if only you would have made like this sort of like. But of course, I think that the place where the text comes from and sort of like, you know, it's an introduction, right? Like to the subject.
Yeah, I think that there is a polemic kind of rhetorical of kind of diminishing things that are clearly more sophisticated just because you're opposing yourself to them. But like, for example, I see a slight difference in saying, for example, he says he's very contradictory. At one point, he does use the expression one value output of an algorithm, like as if everything is going to come down to one number, right? And not everything can fit in one number. But then in other parts of the text, he will say something like, well, you want to have like the crunching of a lot of information and get a multidimensional kind of view so that decisions can be made. So that's not really the same thing.
Yeah, of course. But I also think that like, just go on. I'll just say something afterwards.
Yeah, no, so my point is, I don't think that, for example, he imagines that the question, given that I'm producing a pencil, which of the two graphites should I buy? That it's through talking with the graphite people that you will find about the trees. I think the point is precisely, since you cannot talk to everyone, you want stuff that processes which can compress, transmit, collect, find the relevant information, right? So I think those are very similar to the things you were describing. I just feel like your argument about taking humans out of the loop, which I think is an argument out of, again, the side debate, which is usually people argue about humans in the loop due to some special higher or superior quality of human decision making. Honestly, I feel like his argument for why you don't want to take humans out of the loop, even if you can, it's political. Like, why?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Like, it's a worse work environment. Like, why would you, you know, treat production as a moment of allocation? Politically, why would that be interesting? Like, it has nothing to, humans can be the stupidest creatures in the universe, as we have proven time and time again in a way. Still, you could argue, like, it's not a matter of being special. So I feel like those are slightly different arguments, you know, like, I totally agree with you on one argument, but I don't see how it covers the second point, you know?
No, I see what you're saying. Like, I just think that, I mean, like, he's making a case, like, but that's also like a really weird argument to make, because these are already, like, in a weird way, these things that he's asking for already exist to a certain extent, right? Like, to which extent they are enforced or successfully enforced is another issue. And I think that, you know, like, I just think that this is in itself like a really like important part, right? Like, why is it that the rules that we already put in place cannot be enforced? For like, right? Like, I think that this is sort of like a much more like forceful argument, right? Like, for the same things, for the very same things, right? Like, and I think that this is just like something that strikes me as very weird. Like, he sort of like builds this whole rhetoric around digital socialism, but he's also just like talking about like regular like standards of production. You know what I'm saying? Like, there seems to be like a disconnect, like, I feel, between the subject matter and what he's actually arguing for, like, more forcefully or more thoroughly, right? And I think that this is something that really bothered me when I read the text, and I think that like there isn't really like, yeah, it's just like I think that like his argument makes perfect sense. Of course, like, we have to find ways of having these protocols, but like at the same time we already have them broadly, right? And they're constantly undermined because of the structure of the world, right? Like of the structure of economics or the structure of like, you know, like of lobbying and so on and so forth. So like bringing it, like, of course, I think that the question of technology, like, I think it's super, like for me, it's super central, right? Like, because in my perspective, right, like having like a much more fine-grained image of technology in this context would really like give us some sense of like how this could be used to enforce what he actually wants us to enforce, which I think it's like a really interesting question in regards to technology in general, or like these like mega complex systems that we're deploying, right? Like, okay, like how do we design them to make them do what we need them to do for us, right? Like, because I think that there's something that makes a lot of sense, right? Like, which is the thing about the pencils, right? Like, you don't have to talk to people because this is already encoded in some sense in the logic of production of pencils, right? Like, that all of these values and how they're translated to the externalities that they put into place or that they become, it's already accounted for to some extent. And then there's like this whole like genre of like how to go about like fucking it up, right? Like, there's this, you know, like if you think about like taxes, right? Like how, you know, like Google and all of these like massive corporations pay taxes supposedly in like are located in Ireland in order to take advantage of Ireland's like very like forgiving tax policy to billion dollar revenue businesses, right? Like because they feel like in some sense like this is like good branding for them, or that it allows them to sort of like have other people paying taxes there, like, right? Like there's this whole genre of like fucking with protocols, and I think that like now I've been thinking, like as we're having this conversation, I've been thinking a lot about Medium Design by Keller Easterling and her other book, Extra Statecraft, that I think are really interesting books of like saying like how certain patterns and standards are just the result of protocols, and the protocols are purposefully designed to be fucked with, right? Like I've been thinking about this in relation to something completely unrelated, but not so unrelated that it doesn't make sense to talk about it, is that like, I don't know if you've been following, any of you, this like GameStop thing that happened a couple of months ago, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is this sort of like, you know, like basically a bunch of like regular Joe traders managed to force some like hedge funds into like, or they discovered that some hedge funds were taking like really problematic positions through buying shorts, and they made these funds lose like tons of money. But the real story for me is like how, you know, like these like regular people traders, right? Like people that just are allowed to participate in the stock market are using Robinhood, which is their like, let's say, the exchange through which they buy and sell these shorts. And like the business model of Robinhood is to actually tell like big hedge fund guys like what regular people are buying as well, right? Like they're producing data for them. And like, so the structure that allows these people to participate in this game and to create some sort of problem is also put in place by some other hugely powerful actors in order to take advantage of it. And they are taking advantage of it because, of course, like this becomes some sort of meme, and people, like regular people, lost a lot of money, but like big hedge funds, there were that could stomach having like tons of volatility in their stock, kept it, and they made like way more money than the regular traders did. Like this is sort of like a very quick summary of the situation, but I think that like something that it's inherent, like an inherent problem of what he's talking about, is like how do we craft protocols that are enforceable in the first place, and there are some sort of like, there's a immunity, I guess, to this sort of like manipulation, right? Like, and I think that like this is, of course, besides the horizon of the text, I think, but I think that this is something that there's very patent on it, that there's like, okay, like great, we can argue about having laws that dictate how things should be produced, but like, don't we already have them?
Yeah, I just, that point there, I think that, you know, I told Caron when you guys were presenting on Reza and the quality of all minds, and previously on the space of reading, that I always feel like there is an underlying, like from the Hegelian treasure, the part about the state seems to have a very important kind of continuity with a sort of way of thinking that seems to me that I find in like Reza's work, and a certain way of approaching sociality of reason that sounds very like Hegel's theory of the state. And I mean, the very fact that protocol, the place you take the idea of protocols is towards the law, I find it very weird, because the whole critique that started, let's say, the perhaps no longer contemporary, but the modern form of socialism was precisely the point that, you know, state forms are not what defines the actual protocols of the world. They come in a second place. They are constrained by an underlying logic that actually is defining which norms become effective and which don't. And even if you create some norms that are supposed to be effective due to the power of the law, they end up just being submitted to something else. Like he gives this very crappy example here, but in the contemporary world, if you pass a law prohibiting the pollution in a certain area, since profit is the actual rule, and it's not enforced by anyone, is the immanent, let's say, logic, well, those companies that manage to pollute without getting caught will have a higher rate of profit, therefore they have an incentive to pollute. The loss comes second, right? The whole critique is the critique of the juridical metaphor for protocols. Like that's where we start from. I don't think that's, let's say, the Achilles heels of what he's saying, because it's against that he's talking about, right? And it has been a socialist trope, and I want to know what you think about this, because I have the impression that it's conspicuously absent of every discussion about rationality, technology, the future of socialism from a certain perspective, which is the very old idea of popular power, which is the idea that when people organize themselves, even if they do things wrong, it's a better mistake than doing it right for the wrong reasons, right? That would be, let's say, a definition of freedom, even. That, I mean, popular justice, as people try to implement it in Chile, at the same time that they were doing the cyber scene kind of experiment, where they had popular trials of people, right? With no common justice law behind, they were just deciding that's actually, you know, it doesn't, if you have, let's say, cultural ideas being very, let's say, weak in terms of their inertia, it's very easy to turn them around. State laws and protocols and norms being a bit stronger, but still easily circumvented, as you were talking about. And you have, let's say, competition and profit as being more immanent forms of organizing normativity, capitalism. Workers' organization supposedly is, you know, at a more fundamental level, for the simple fact that it is the thing carrying most of the world anyway already, right? It's already the thing that is kind of the backbone somehow. And that dimension of political struggle, political organization, collective stuff, which is not really reducible back to allocation through money, nor reducible back to formulation of norms, nor reducible to cultural agendas. It doesn't seem to play any useful part. Like, I sometimes feel like the combination of technology and information, it supposedly makes the combination of labor and collectivity kind of a thing of the past. It's like the cheapest form, the subjective form, the humanist form of the same thing. Like, why have collectivity based on human values, which are restrictive, segregatory, violent, and so on, when we can have much more rich, complex environment of information exchange, or that is kind of constructed with that orientation? And why focus on the subjective position of work and human exceptionalism when we can focus on the objective kind of imprint of forms that is already kind of embodied in means of production, machines, technology, and so on and so forth. So I just wanted to know, like, if that's an underlying kind of assumption. No, it's okay. This is kind of a thing of when the world was smaller, and that made sense then. And let's say we're at least suspending the hypothesis that this is a useful tool, so that when we, for example, question norms that are subverted by big capitalist enterprise, we have no problem extending the question of, won't they be subverted by anyone else who tries to establish something else, right? Because that's kind of weight of popular power is not relevant, or else it is a relevant means, in the sense that, as you were saying, you also buy into the idea that automation is not a necessary tendency of the capitalist world. Therefore, actual automation, actual advancement in the uses of these technologies will have to be, let's say, the effect of popular demand, right? But even in that case, it seems like this kind of trust in what socialism was supposed to be, right? Trust in this sort of domain of life seems like a more utilitarian kind of means towards another end. So I just wanted to also know, like, how would you put those things into the picture, you know? Because I think that the idea that protocols, democracy, these things are weak, they are faulty tools compared with other possibilities. I buy that if we understand them as like agreements between people that probably are sanctioned by states. But I'm not sure that this is what, let's say, this long history of democratic socialism or democracy in the workplace or council communism, that they were really aiming at such a state-like approach to norms and things like this, you know? So I just wanted to know, like, if, I'm not sure how this fits into...
No, but like I think that this is like a really interesting question, like, right, like if I understand correctly, is like how, because I think that the question of like how these protocols are put into place is like really underexplored, right? Like of like alternative means of putting protocols into place, right? Like, and I think that it is, of course, really like the core issue almost, right? Like, because I think that the move from like a very specific kind of logic of production that he like puts himself against, like already hints of like having another logic like waiting in the wings to replace that. But I think that the question of like, I mean, like I think about it in like a really, like in really operational terms of like, okay, cool, like how these protocols are put into place, like practically, like maybe because this is like, I think about this from the perspective of design in a weird way. Like all of this is like, I think about it through design. And I don't really like have a sense that what I think he's actually saying is that, like, you know, like in a weird way, is like nothing can replace political struggle, right? Like that technological means still are like technological means.
Yeah, I think you could summarize it in the way that, like, say,
yeah,
it is not only, it's not because it's necessary, but it's desirable that some
exactly
in this kind of approach has a clear role for political struggle that is not only accessory to something else, in the sense of, now we have something to struggle for. We're gonna there should be a popular demand for increased automation, but actually a constitutive part of the thing you want to build.
Yeah, no, for sure. But that's also the, like, I just had this feeling of like, okay, like we can, like, this is like a very easily acceptable argument, right? Like that he makes, sort of. But like for me, what I think is interesting about this question is like, can a different level, like can a different nuance in the understanding of technology, which I think is incidentally like the question that I'm really interested in regards to this and in general, like can like a much more nuanced understanding of technology like deliver like a better sense of how these can, like these technologies, or maybe broadly speaking, can facilitate political struggle, can aid political struggle. And I think that like the way that the argument is built is like, no, like there isn't any way in which this could be the case. Isn't it? Like it is a little bit, I think.
I mean, there's the actual sentence, like, you know, there are emancipatory potentials for digital socialism in the text. Like, I really think it's a matter of focus, because
Yeah,
I mean,
for
this
sure.
is my own critique. I mean, the reason why I align with him is because, for example, when I read this, like the Inventing the Future, and some texts that are more focused on the sort of, which I think are, honestly, I mean, there aren't that many other proposals which are novel, have a real interest in contemporary technological advancements, and still have a foot on actual political strategy as this leftist accelerationist project in its more down-to-earth version, which I think is the Nick's version, right? It's not like fully.
Actually, I think it's Alex's book that came out last year with Verso. Like, this is like, it's the most like down-to-earth thing.
Yeah, and I think that they're becoming more and more down-to-earth with time, because they're also close to the government. They had like good inputs of people in the Labour Party as to how things can go. And the interesting thing to me, which I think is very telling, is that when it comes to talk about politics, I think that they put their cards on the table by mistake, almost, like, or not really thinking about it, because the political theories that goes with that is the political theorist of populism, right? And Laclau is a theorist where struggles are, let's say, seen from the perspective of circulation, right? You have multiple demands, and they are equivalent to a master signifier. He kind of takes the theory of, the theory of money and applies it to the theory of political demands. And that's exactly where they go. So the idea that, well, the political counterpart to this is the power of this imagination to aggregate several struggles as, let's say, striving for it, right? So popular struggle comes up in the picture as a form of further popular support for this policy, right? I don't think it's coincidence that when they started really coming close to political decision making, the reduction of the labor week was obviously a more popular position than, let's say, investment in means to optimize or rethink allocation. But I find this interesting that the place for politics in this perspective, which in many ways is one of the most sophisticated versions of any leftist program around, it has very little use for the reality of political struggle to inform it in any way. So at the same time that I totally agree that, well, it's stupid to prefer to know less about technological tools available and what they can do. I mean, why would you restrain yourself just gratuitously? On the other hand, it does seem like the inverse happens, where the reality of political struggle doesn't really seem to play any relevant part in this imagination, and that's kind of weird. And for example,
I think,
sorry, just to conclude, like, this is a good example. Like, why are we thinking about this particular platform and not other more sophisticated, complicated, or even more interesting things? Simply because, I mean, at least from my personal experience, there isn't, people are not capable, or not at the moment, or not, or at least haven't really seemed like those things can be fitted into the political reality that they're internal to, right? I mean, I think we have a really interesting moment in Brazil, for example, with the strike of the iFood, with the delivery guys and so on, with this idea that suddenly, when you break some logistical chain, you can ask yourself certain questions. Like, they're not asked by us, they're asked by people who are actually in the streets. And then you can make those questions more consistent if you find tools that show that there are other ways to address those questions, right? Which is the same thing, I think, with this platform. Like, there is a discourse that we didn't invent about problems in political organization, mapping organizations. I mean, no wonder that we quickly start finding online other projects going in the same direction, like the Black Socialists of America, because it's the need for that tool doesn't spring from the possibility of it existing, springs from the organizational challenges. So it's hard to imagine how any of this would have any traction, and not only because, let's say, there isn't an advanced enough consciousness, but on the contrary, like, because the rare and interesting thing is the political traction of the tool, right? I mean, it's interesting to have a high precision drawing tool if you have a high precision drawing to make, right? Or if you have time to make it. Otherwise, it's not, right? To be able to produce the time or to create the problem that makes people say, well, if I had a high precision drawing tool right now, you know, I think that's where what he calls protocols, and I think New Ref was also pointing towards more, come in, like the sort of mediating strategy to bind together concrete problems at the level of labor, which can be reproductive, productive, logistical, but whatever, and this sort of, well, you can build some other routes to kind of fill in the gaps. You don't need to simply stop an interrupting moment, so like a strike, and just wait and reconnect it back to the same circuit of valorization, you know? But I feel like I think shifting that perspective is what his work is about, not really setting these tools aside.
No. I agree with your perspective, but there's something that you were talking about that, and it made me realize something that I think that like it's very central to the Accelerationist Manifesto and Nick and Alex's book, right? Like Inventing the Future. Like there's like the sort of like everything's built around this critique of folk politics, right?
Yeah,
and I think that like, and I think that the thing that they do is sort of saying like, well, you know, like the political struggle cannot replace high level strategizing by institutional actors, right? Like this is sort of the argument. And I think that like NeoRat, like Twitter, because there's the only place that it exists, sort of like accept this like without any sort of reservation, right? Like, and I think that because you were talking about like this sort of his book on the and critiquing this idea of automation as this sort of like inexorable like drive toward that we're in this inexorable drive towards, and I think it's like actually it's like, no guys, like this is not what's going on, right? And I think that, you know, like last year or like in 2019, like it was very clear how like stuff like Extinction Rebellion was like making a huge change in Europe or like in the UK, right? Like, so there was this sort of like moment where people were like, oh, actually folk politics do work, right? Like when it's organized and targeted towards like high leverage, like thinking here a little bit like the invisible committee type of thing. Like when you actually target like relevant infrastructure, it works really well, right? Like maybe getting like everyone together at a park in Manhattan like doesn't really do it, but like when you target like train stations and airports and so on and so forth, like you actually gain some sort of like traction because it's economical, like it's multimodal rather than like, oh yeah, like we're here just like playing our protest songs. And I think that this is sort of like in a weird way, I think that this text is really about like recovering folk politics, but like or like not recovering folk politics, but like, oh no, actually political struggle has this other dimension that is about like sort of constructing the shared ideals in which we organize our stuff.
Yeah.
And I think that this is, and I think this is like really like a really nice point for it. Like, you know, like when you look through this perspective, I think it's actually a nice text. But like, I think that if everything is in place, like it's a much nicer argument, right? Like it's a much more nuanced and organized. But I wanted to go back to something that we were talking about before, which I think is really important. Like you're talking about like the incentive to pollute, right? And I think that this is like a really interesting case of like how things are changing. And I think it's Wendy Brown that does like this like nice like argument against neoliberalism that's saying, well, actually the problem is that we're using like national sovereignties to fight against, or it's not fight, but to like negotiate with transnational entities. Right, and that like their jurisdiction is completely limited compared to like, you know, like whatever Amazon, Google, like whatever these like massive technological companies have in terms of like assets and organization. And I started thinking about Benjamin's book, like The Stack, which sort of like increasingly argues again like for like a reconstitution of this idea of like politics based on these actors, right? Like on these like mega transnational actors, because that's what he does, but not really, like that's not the argument of the book by any means, right? Like he's talking about his own thing, right? Like and the impact and accidental mega structure, so on and so forth. But I think that like something that is really interesting about what he talks about in the first part is really how like laws have become increasingly like branding, or not branding, but like capital acquisition strategies for nation states, right? Like nation states are constantly looking for these massive corporate actors to drop in cash and to create and to facilitate structures that allow this to happen in a much more streamlined way. And I think that this is something that is like a really interesting reversal, I think, of like how do we understand like regular political economy. And I think this goes like directly against this, not directly against, but like goes really well with the idea of the protocol, right? Like what is the protocol and how to craft these protocols that would allow us to make, because like it's really like also like more further for like science fiction, but like if you think about like, you know, these like technologically advanced socialist states, and it's like, what are the roles of these massive capitalist corporations in this scenario, right? Like because they're like in how things are organized in the world, they'll never stop existing, right? Like this is like, you know, too complicated. And I think like Nick and Alex had like published like really like, or also in Jacobin magazine, there's this sort of like, let's nationalize Walmart, let's nationalize Amazon, let's nationalize Google, and so on and so forth. But I think that this is also like, this is like another instance of like trying to solve these things, but like with magic, right? Like, oh, like we're gonna magically alter the way that these deals are put into place in our world. And I think that like no real account of protocols, in my mind at least, can be like pragmatic if it refrains from engaging with this like sort of post-sovereignty economy. And I think that like maybe this is something that bothers me a little bit in the text, but it was like really hard to articulate before thinking about it in these terms, right? Like that there's something like really complex about how technology also enables these arrangements to be made in ways that are counter to the ways in which we want to organize our world, right? Like thinking about, you know, like digital citizenship in Estonia and like, you know, Irish tax laws and so on and so forth, like, you know, nationalized tax, be it in Russia, where they tried to put their own internet into place and they fucked up everything. Or like when I was living in Russia, there was this sort of, like they tried to take down Telegram and they ended up taking down Amazon in Russia because Telegram was hosted on Amazon web servers, and like Telegram kept working, but Amazon, like people could no longer order stuff on Amazon. So like there's these like really like nuanced ways of thinking about the imbrication of the technical with the governmental and with the political. And I think that like by sort of like raising the flag of protocols, you sort of miss out on all of this, because it's actually addressing this need to sort of like, what is the, like, because it also can understand, you know, like the way in which, like, you know, I mean, not the way in which, because I think that this is also like really a contentious topic that I think was going to be addressed or somehow was addressed, but like the protests in Hong Kong, like no matter the level of their their operational sophistication, there's really nothing to be done, right? And then there's all of these scenarios where actual political struggle makes a ton of difference, and it makes less because the arrangement in which is deployed is much more complex. So I think that yeah, like now I'm ranting just a little bit, but I think there's like I think basically my whole point is like more nuance, because I think that it sort of brings like a different level of clarity to what is actually that we're proposing, right? Or what we want to propose. And just to finish this, I think that the question, I think of like, for instance, the role of like, I think the strike of I don't know iFood, because I haven't really looked into how iFood is structured, but like whenever like Uber drivers strike, like, I mean, like it's so bizarre how these companies are structured, because like it doesn't really matter for them, right? Like there's no real sense of like why, like of course they do, and it has an effect on the operational reality of the platform in a given place, but like Uber has never turned profit ever. It just exists in a bubble of VC valuation. So like there's this sort of like underlying structure that allows it to minimize political struggle to a certain sense. And I think that if we don't look at these other, like, you know, like there's so much to this that could be thought about in the ways in which this is tied to a platform logic.
That I think you said the most important thing now. Like, I feel like I think this is something that we can really build upon. Both the fact that, as you said, there is I agree totally with you that Benanav is kind of trying to say, and I think that is a very, I mean, it's a position that the best place to argue from is from the standpoint of production and labor, which is that there is the intransitive or the sort of inelastic difference between macro scale strategy and micro scale folk politics. It's only so kind of static for certain strategies and for certain types of protests, where, for example, the very idea of production, and I think it's something that Dennis and I have been, I mean, we hope we'll be able to present something on it next week. But the whole point of production is precisely that it's constantly shifting what counts as local, depending on what counts as global in capitalism. So even price, what a price is, there is no one price circulating. Price has different nuances depending on what is the totality that defines the average profit rate for that sector. So different people are calculating different price, as if prices mean different things depending on which totality they are addressing. So there isn't, it's good to have a grammar where the exact nuance and the exact criteria through which you're gonna judge what is interesting and what is not is coupled with something about this totality. And I think that you gave an example that I take a slightly different position. For example, we talk about a strike of delivery workers. You can ask two different questions. Of course, it's good to ask both, but you can feel like there are different emphases. One is, what did this do for the company? And then you can conclude, well, it didn't do much, therefore, a different strategy is more interesting than popular strike, riots, or whatever. On the other hand, you can ask the question, what did it do for the delivery workers? Who are the ones who are striking? Who are the ones who have demands? Not me. My demands that the company should be damaged. That's not necessarily the person's demand. So to begin with, the nuance should be defined by the political demand, not by our analysis of the situation. And I think that already shows the difference between, for example, the fact that we need a much more nuanced understanding of technological means, given examples such as trying to bring down Telegram and not manage to do, and some other fuck-ups like those, versus, for example, setting yourself in this more situated point of view, which is still connected with some global strategic point of view, might be not so clearly connected, because that's the whole point of it, right? We know how to see the connection between the local and the global for capitalist phenomena, but we don't know how to see them for anything else. Perhaps not even with climate, right? So it's different to, let's say, turn and look at the technological tools from the standpoint of the question, what would cause some damage to iFood, right? And you can look at, for example, Robinhood, the whole GameStop thing, and things like this, which they might produce an effect. But it's different to assume the standpoint of the people who are rioting, and then the actual tools that might be relevant might be others. You know, I think that's a bit where his argument goes towards, like in the best version of it, which is definitely not written in this text. Like, I think the best version of his argument is actually written in this book here. It's a book by a couple of it's one guy is a French sociologist of work. The other guy is was at least on one of these committees for nuclear energy in France or whatever. And they did a lot of field work trying to understand how do you talk about science and technology with communities. So for example, a community is going to be affected by the decision, do we put a nuclear plant here or not? There is already all the information about the terrain, the good reasons to do it, the bad reasons to do it, but nothing guarantees that this can be translated into the form of a decision, right? That they can back it up and have popular support, for example. So they created this theory of hybrid forums, where you gather all this input coming from expert understanding of, you know, technology and science involved, and even better understanding of social issues than the very people who are in the region, right? But they realize that there is a need to kind of, it's a weird political problem where you can do better, but you choose not to for some, in order to guarantee something in the output that is not, that has supposedly warrants the name of justice in some sense. I think that in their case here, I mean, they are French social democrats, so you don't expect too much of them. But in the sense of showing like interesting field work around this problem, I think it's a good example of, you know, the separating these two issues, having the best possible understanding and being the least ignorant about what technology can do, but then keeping that the issue of what are the interesting tools, or what's the proper resolution to analyze these things open until the struggle the situation of struggle kind of defines what is the point of view that counts. That's the part that I think is, if I were to summarize anything, I would say that the good part for me, what Bananav calls protocols, is that you don't, like, you need the situated point of view, right? Labor was for 100 years the name of a situated point of view, and might not be anymore. And I think there are good reasons to say that it's hard to know where that point of view is, right, or where it's looking from. But I think that these protocols could be understood as a separate question, where you're the least stupid about what can be done, but then you need certain protocols to define what should be done from the standpoint of some struggle. That's perhaps how I would separate the two things, you know? And since the productive sphere is already plastic, this can change from point to point, right? A small cooperative in the interior of Brazil might need some things and might think itself in some ways that are not clearly gonna, you know, translate into sophisticated terms, but you do want to adapt to that case, some basic tool, but then in other place you might need something else. And I think that's how I would kind of try to portray this problem in a light that doesn't look so crappy as I think it does, you know.
No, for sure. But you know, I was just thinking about this, and I think I'm not sure who said this, but there's two things, right? Like there's this one article from these Chinese economists saying like how would they go about structuring a machine learning algorithm for a planned economy. I haven't really read it yet, but I've been like I've known about it for a long while, and I really wanted to bring this into the discussion, but I just didn't really have time to go through it. But like, I think there's something that is quite nice about this that you're saying, is that like this idea of central data processing, like central information processing, versus like distributed information processing, right? Like, and I think that there's something like I think that there's something that could be really understood in these terms of like, okay, like maybe the reality is that like one of the problems is that like we just simply didn't have like of traditional communist planned economies, is that there wasn't just like enough sensors, right? There wasn't enough like entry points of data that are situated enough in local contexts to understand the realities of these. And like if you think about like Russia, of course, like it's like fucking massive. Like there's like, you know, time zones that are in the same time zone of like New Zealand and whatever. And so there's a very heterogeneous understanding of what are the actual necessities of different places, right? And I think that this is sort of like a nice way of thinking about this sort of like the imaginary argument of this text that we're inventing right now. That is like, okay, like there's only one way of doing this, and it's having like some sort of like having like in these sort of like very like hippie Salamaean terms, like good transits from the local to the global, right? Like and putting together structures that would allow for it, both in the sort of like governance sense of like actual humans crafting the protocols, but also in the systems that are put into place that would integrate these local perspectives into a global perspective. And I think that this is sort of like the way in which we would think about it, and it's interesting, right? Like because of thinking of, you know, like these like, and then it becomes like a really about applied technology, or what is the sort of like actual thing that is being done with it. So like in like, yeah, maybe like 2 years ago, yeah, it was like in 2018 when I was at Stroka, we had this sort of like 3-week-long seminar thing with people from Google. And one of the guys was saying to us that they like now they make their own cell phones, right? Like, and their cell phones, the processor comes with like pre-installed, pre-trained machine learning algorithms, but that very soon, like they would be able to make like really small like processors that would be able to be trained at the spot that they're deployed, right? Like that they call it, like they have like really like nice names for everything, so they call it computing at the edges, which I think it's a really nice name. But like it's just the idea that like you would somehow like, you know, like thinking about this in a more like operational in the terms that we were discussing, like you would train algorithms locally, but this model would also integrate with a global model, right? Of like how things have to function in order to accommodate the necessities of specific places. But like this is like actual practical stuff that's being built. So like I also think it's nice to sort of, I think the thing about nuance, and I think the thing about like how to get allies that I was talking about earlier has to do a little bit of this. Is like, how do we actually talk to these people that are making these things so that they don't think we're dumb? You know, there's like, oh yeah, like, you know what I'm saying? So like, I think that, you know, to do like real technical work that it's aligned with these problems, it's like a massive, I think, requirement for us to even get to have this discussion. Like, you know, like there's this sort of sense in which, like, to sort of like grease the wheels that need to be greased, like we need to have like really robust technical arguments. And I think that
I totally buy that. I totally buy that. I think that's a great point. I mean, it's the part that I think I'm kind of constantly going back to, which I think again is complementary. It's not kind of antagonistic in any way. It's just that I have the impression that if you were to like get the drunken banana version of the text, it would be something like, you guys want to cut corners. Like, it seems like the hard conversation to have is a technical conversation, but the hard conversation to have is the non-technical one. Like, it's easier to imagine today a shorter path through technology to something better than to, but with no, like with, where it's not really answering to anyone's particular demand, than to actually tailor something to the demand of political struggle, because they don't talk that way. That's why I think he's also like the way the book works, it's very technical for political economy. It's clearly he would never write in that book in such a kind of depreciative tone towards things that he's obviously involved in. I feel like part of the reason why the rhetoric of the text is a bit vulgar in its depiction of technology is kind of to stress that point of view, where you're gonna have, like, it seems like it's a shorter, obvious path. It's just there, struggle, organization, or whatever. But that seems to be a harder transition to make with interesting technological tools than the one where we augment our understanding to be able to talk with technicians who could, for example, implement something or give a more complete description of these tools, you know? It might be totally polemical, and I might be off here on his end. He's just really being the naive guy. But I have the impression that this goes together with the where political struggle and popular power comes into the picture. Like, if it comes as a means, you can imagine in no dialogue with that and just then present it. But if that comes as a sort of primary standpoint, it creates a weird contradiction between the fact that there are very rich tools, technical tools, and at the same time, even if you can, there might be something other that is desirable, that is slightly less sophisticated, you know? But I don't know. Again, it's the ranting part of the night. I might be just going off. But again, I don't think this argument goes against anything you said. I'm totally on page with you.
Just
No, for sure, but
a little something actually is related to
previous topic in the conversation. I was kind of busy here with things of the house, so I didn't get to mention it about, you know, the new React thing, the left Excel. I think it's a mistake to think of the, I mean, not a mistake that you were making, Gabriel, or anybody here. I think it's a general mistake that people make to think of left accelerationism as something that can be generalized. There's a weird noise coming from your end.
For me, let me.
Yeah. No, I don't think it can be generalized beyond the specific constraints of the time that the book was written. I don't think that program works beyond that time. That was 2015. I think I had this conversation here before, but I don't think this is a strategy to be remobilized, or I just don't think so. I think it was a specific program for a specific period when there was kind of a hope that, you know, Corbyn would be in office and Sanders and all of that. So I always read the book as a kind of suggestion for policies to be implemented by government. So this was always my critique. I agree with Gabriel, actually. For me, it was always lacking some sort of account of political agency beyond that of, you know, policymakers, because it is always it's a plea for a kind of top-down approach that needs a certain the position of the state or of government. There is, I agree there I agree with Pedro, there is a point about organization that comes from the critique of localism and folk politics and all of that, but it is not saying that you don't need localism. It is saying that you need local struggles, but they are not sufficient, that you need some sort of coalition of several struggles and some sort of coordination. And then they propose to imitate the Mont Pelerin strategy of the economic right in order to bring this about and gain power and all that. So there is a kind of recipe there for gaining power. But I think the point of view is always the point of view of the one, if not in government, or the one that is the head of a certain think tank. There's very little there about the position of the ones of the underdog engaged in a specific struggle. This was always my critique, and I think it's a mistake to think that left Excel is still a viable position. I don't think it is at all. This much I was saying in our live show here about the translation that I did about Reza. People still want to think about even Reza like a sort of a political program. It's got political ideas in a sense, but it's not a political program. It doesn't have a tactic. It doesn't have a strategy. It is a philosophy that yields certain political consequences, but not in the practical sense. So this was something I was insisting upon. This is a philosophy text. This is a philosophy essay. This is not a political essay by any means. There's some adumbrations here and there, but those are in the sense of what is compatible with this philosophical point of view I'm putting forward. Oh, this is compatible, but there's no practical recipe at all. So I think it's a mistake that many people make, to think that, you know, inhumanism is a political project. Maybe it's political in the same sense, you see, as a work of art that I'm doing tomorrow is political. Like maybe in that sense, or it's political because it has political ideas embodied in that thing, you see. So
yeah, but I mean, don't you feel like
no framework? Actually, I don't think it's really a framework specifically designed and actually in the right measure for political action. I don't think so.
Yeah, but I mean, I think that's why Benanab also wrote the book now. It's because, let's say, the accelerationist, the inventing the future, let's take this as an example. It's, let's say, the least bad version of an ongoing argument that they were not the only ones to make, and it's still on the table, a big debate on political economy about the relation between automation and work. That issue hasn't disappeared with inventing the futures, anachronism, or post-Brexit.
Yeah, there are some points there that remain. Yes, I see. Yeah, but the thing is,
but I mean, don't you find it relevant? For example, in our discussion today, there was a moment where we were talking about, for example, like one argument that I see made many times. I think Pedro is like 100 times more sophisticated than it, but it's made in the worst form very often. That, well, capitalism, to exploit us better, needs to develop certain technological tools, and these technological means, they can be detoured, right, and subverted, and so there is always a sort of
repurposed,
and there is a sort of shorter path to the repurposing of technology versus something else. So I feel like the underlying debate that is the interesting part for me is that it's the issue of, you have this, for example, from a different perspective, there is a diagnosis today that there is something about the social fabric which is ridiculously impoverished and much less disconnected. And let's say sociality doesn't travel where information does. There is a mismatch between the integration of information in the globe and the social integration in the globe, not in the sense even of equality, merely in the sense of connection between systems of value broadly understood in different places, right? The issue is that once you see like that you have these islands that don't communicate in any concrete political sense, you can put your eggs on different baskets. And I feel like the automation basket is one that says, look, guys, we need to focus on the technical understanding of these tools. That's to say, right now, the theoretical political sphere had like the vanguard of the problem, because some things are going to happen whether we want it or not, and we need to be ready. And so you're relying on a kind of dynamic, and you want to meet it later on. It's highly acceptable. It's an interesting strategy, but you're assuming something is going to happen because it needs to happen due to economic reasons, right?
Yeah.
I think Benanab is trying to, and at that point, I think that the discussion is very, very contemporary, which is to say that fracture is not going to be mended by anything, because the fracture is the profitable thing, right? Is the mismatch between the cohesion of the social world and the cohesion of the information world that makes these things profitable. It is the mismatch between the two. So you cannot count on that tendency and work to meet it ahead. If you could count with it, it would be the most rational course of action. So I have the impression that being this labor historian and a guy with endnotes, like one of the big pieces of endnotes, and Theorie Communiste, the guys that John got us to read the other day, is that there is a crisis of social composition because of the new forms of labor, and there is a crucial mismatch to take into consideration between the political connectivity of the world and the information connectivity, and those two things one thing will not mend the other. So the argument that you should run ahead with those questions in mind to meet the world a bit further down, that's kind of putting question. And then the question becomes, first, what do technical tools become in this fractured world, right? They start looking slightly different, perhaps. And, okay, what else becomes, let's say, the things to kind of anticipate? So I think that, like, the part of this debate that for me remains contemporary, it kind of goes in that direction, you know?
Yeah, no, there's a big debate about also UBI, and yeah, there are some points in the book that remain contemporary, but I don't know.
Actually, I think for the book, I was just thinking about this right now because I think that something that I think Gabriel just mentioned is this like, well, like capitalism produces these advanced technological tools, and it is our duty as like leftists to sort of come up with ways in which these could be used towards the goals that we set for ourselves. But I think that there's something like a much more complex argument that I think, like, I don't remember it very well, but I think it is made somewhere in Inventing the Future, that it's actually like technology is not developing as fast as we
they do make
fast as we think it is, because capitalism stops it from doing it. And I think that like there could be like a really interesting sort of like hybrid here of like, okay, but like how do we actually like reconsider, because I think that like a lot, like a really like recurrent argument of like digital or algorithmic socialism sort of like it's a standing for the argument of like how does research and development works in a communist society. But this simply overlooks the fact that like most of the technology that we use in our daily lives has been like commissioned by the American Department of Defense.
Mm-hmm.
Right, like there's like a massive role for like governments in the production of these technologies. And I think that like the argument is like the sort of like the structure of all these things is so complex that like, well, like maybe is it like technological development in itself could be like like an interesting rallying cry in a certain sense of like, okay, like what we're actually saying is that like we need just better tools to do these things, or like like the level of resolution, like, and that that political struggle could be organized in this sense. And I think that this is where the automation thing could like somehow become again like on this register of the demand that Gabriel was talking about. This like, oh, what is a demand that we organize ourselves against? And this has like some sort of like resonance with the book that Gabriel just mentioned. It's like, how do you like essentially mediate between like experts and the populations that are affected by this sort of implementation? And I think that like there isn't really any sense of like how this could be possible, but I just think in general of like what is the sort of and I think that this is like a very like in a weird way like a very Hegelian point of like we just need like a better assessment of where we are in a weird way. And I think that like a lot of the sort of like clashes that we have in arguing around this text is just not having like what is the optimal picture to develop a strategy. Like now I'm thinking like in very explicit design terms, right? Like, but what is the what is the most precise assessment that we can have? And I think that this brings the political struggle thing back to the central spot, right? Like because like this is how like the assessment gets better, right? Like this is how the picture gets better. And this is like maybe like intuitively how the political struggle is already present in this sort of like the pragmatic Hegel world, right? Like that this is like the way in which like a picture of the world is increasingly rendered cohesive or clear, in the same way that like the logical space of reasons tends towards, like not that tends towards, I don't think it's the right way of saying it, but like increasingly becomes rational, right? Like, but also that's not really the case. And I think that this opens up like a whole another can of worms, but just saying that like,
yeah, I
like
would
by sort of
today, I think it's too much already.
no, yeah, it's like it's sort of like this sort of like megalomaniac ranting mode
No, but
that it's explicitly designed for the.
but it's good to hear you talking about Hegel in your megalomaniac renting mode. It's the appropriate mode for talking about.
Yeah, the thing is,
Exactly.
You mentioned that the struggle for, I don't know, technological development and the political struggle in terms of, I don't know, more egalitarian models of society should go hand in hand, and so and something like that. But the problem is that exactly how I mean, if you let's concede everything that Inventing the Future is saying. So the problem is that Inventing the Future is actually a portrait of left accelerationism, because one way of understanding the difference from left and right accelerationism is that left accelerationism is not a break with Deleuze and Guattari. Left accelerationism is actually a reading. They portray themselves as more faithful to Deleuze and Guattari because, you know, there's this thought in, you know, Anti-Oedipus, which is, you know, the Bible of accelerationism itself, that capital territorializes with another hand what it deterritorializes with one hand. And this is something that, you know, Nick Land and all those positions forgot about, basically. So given that this technological development is going on under capital, and if capital does that, how will you accelerate, so to speak, you know, technological development beyond what capital is re-territorializing inside its own, you know, morphology, its own norms, its own rules? So I'm not sure. I mean, if there is a way out of this conundrum by staying within the same, you know, set of assumptions. Within those set of assumptions, it seems that there's no escape. You see, there. I mean, I'm saying, of course, this is also a rant, but I mean, I was very.
This is the moment, man. This is the moment, friend.
I was very interested in this whole business of left Excel. Of course, you know about it, Pedro, and all that. Of course, there was this connection to a certain philosophy that I'm interested in and all that, but I'm skeptical of its political cogency because of that. It seems that there's something lacking in the theoretical framework that might enable this, you know, escape route from capital through technology. But if technology is by definition entwined within this capitalist form of demand for technique, right? It doesn't seem to be possible to go beyond that, other than, this is why I have this kind of argument against the book nowadays, other than by a kind of developmental national government, you know, like Dilma Rousseff or, I don't know, Ciro Gomes or something like that, that will, you know, try to nationalize, you know, all these technical capital, technical apparatus, you know. And this is still, I don't know, it seems like a resisting force, not an accelerating one, in a sense, you see. So I don't think, I'm very skeptical about left accelerationism today. I mean, the framework that was put forward then and there, you know. I think there is some. I mean, of course, the overarching philosophy, of course, you know, the stuff I'm trying to develop here in this group is not unrelated to some components of that, but I also tend to disentangle, you know, Sellers and Brandon, this kind of thing, from the left accelerationist political interpretation of that. I think Sellers and Brandon are transcendental philosophers. You see, I mean, they are talking about the conditions of cognition and of language use. I'm not sure they are talking about empirical, you know, instantiatable relations. So I think this question emerged here when we were talking about the space of reason. Oh, but this space of reason is not how things are going on. No, it's not, because it is a descriptive framework in order to understand language use and the expectations that obtain between language users, in a sense. So it's not really about being implemented as such, and you see having the space of reasons as a social totality or something like that. It's not a social totality in that sense, in the empirical sense. Because it's always, and this is, I think this was our argument even, that text by Justin Evans, that oh, it's an impoverished space of reasons. I'm still not convinced by it, because, for instance, if there is certain conditions that obtain in order to have speakers of a language, and this is the philosophical part, in order to have language and speech and thinking and all of that. So Evans is actually asking the same question: why aren't we free then, if this is the case? No, because there is, and he's downplaying this problem. There is, it's a multimodal thing. It's a multimodal system, several layers influencing each other, first of all. Second, these several layers, some of which are, justificatory relations in the sense of the space of reason. Some of it are causal relations, are simple pattern governed, things goings on, So, and it's non-monotonic also. So even if you are in the environment of ethical reasoning, let us say, and you know what's best to do, it's a non-monotonic kind of reasoning. Like if you have a certain collateral commitment that appears because of a certain intermission that comes from other place, you won't obtain the conclusion that you ought to have. So the difference between, I think, my take on this and other people that think that, oh, maybe then the framework is bad, the framework is not operative. I think the framework is operative, but it is inconsistent at the same time. Like, it is operative because without these expectations and this logical structure, I don't think we would be able to be talking and reasoning. At the same time, it is not completed, it is not consistent, it is always being skewed and having intermissions coming from, anywhere and all of that. So this kind of allegorical interpretation of the space of reasons as something that will be empirically instantiated. I don't think for me, space of reasons is a transcendental framework. It's not an empirical one. It helps understanding action and reasoning and all of that, but I don't see it as having direct political valence. And this was my point in the live about Reza also. It interests me, the political consequences of this interest me, but I don't think it has a direct political valence, only an indirect one. So in order to have to think directly about the political, I tend to agree with Gabriel, and this was my point one of my points in the comparison that I drew between Reza and Gabriel's framework, is that you need some form of localization. You need some form of localization and demand to get traction upon the situation and to orient oneself within the situation. And then and maybe that's the point that I disagree maybe with Gabriel, that this orientation does not come fully from the situation. It comes from a certain framework wherein you can understand reasoning and language use as such. So this is maybe my supplementation to that. But regarding specifically political thinking, I think there is much lacking in these attempts to kind of mobilize directly the Brandomian framework. I don't think it lends itself well to that direct mobilization. Sorry about the rant.
For sure it doesn't, but I also think that no, it's good, because I think that like it sort of coincides a lot with a lot of what I've been thinking, especially in this sort of like big picture like project organization, is that like it is just required to have like a kind of like Quinian Wilsonian turn in order to operationalize these things for some consistency, right? Like that, whether like if you have to sort of like in some sense abandon the idea of like shared ideals and move towards cognitive technologies. Like that, this is how I feel, and that I feel that I'm like structuring my own work around this. Like if you don't move towards that, like you can't really do much with it.
Yeah. I see that the vector you're moving is like a certain form of localization within a certain set of constraints, not all constraints, but a certain set of technical constraints that must be worked through in order to have a proper instantiation of a certain social reality that we are interested in. So yes, I see what the way you're, the sense of the direction where you're moving to. Yeah, of course.
Sorry, no, I was just going to say I'll have to go in a second, but Pedro, I can leave you as the co-host with, and if you guys want to continue.
I think we could wrap up. I mean, Pedro can maybe have a last.
Yeah, we can definitely wrap up.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
No, I think we could.
Okay. Oh.
No, for sure. I think we can definitely wrap up. I think that there's like, well, I think it's just a sense of like how to sort of structure this discussion around like how to better get a sense of like the picture that we're drawing all the time. And I think that like this move that I was just referring towards, like cognitive technologies, has to do with this. Like it's really centered around this and a more like maybe evolutionary perspective. But I think that this is something that struck me as the tech, like, and thinking about it now and this continuing makes tons of sense, is that like when you sort of like make all these simplifications in order to have, in order for us to have like an argument, we're like obligingly leaving so much detail out of it that it almost rends the discussion useless. Like, and I think that what we did today is sort of like add back the sort of complexity that we wanted in this text. And I think that like it suddenly makes way more sense, right? Like after everything that we talked about, like the text has this sort of like other life, that it can be the starting point for like many like interlockings with other things that we talked about. And I think that this is like why we're having this discussion in the end, right? Like, and it sort of like has this like nice resonance to it, I think.
No, I think you're totally right.
Cool.
I think that's the perfect way to end it. Like, yeah, Pedro, I think you're right.
Yeah.
Far out.
Yeah, cool.
With a suspicious cigarette in my hands, I said far out.
Great, guys. I really need to run. Pedro, I think you are totally right on doing this in a more informal way. There are ways of like getting discussions to move in more kind of fine-grained ways, that doing things in this way really helps.
Okay, that's it.
Okay, guys.
Thanks, Pedro.
See ya.
See you guys.
Take care.
Bye.